Oh, look, people are coming in already. Just gonna wait for some folks to come in. This will be our most exciting webinar ever. Maybe not, but it'll be fun. Hello, beautiful people. Hope you guys are doing good. All right. So, Queenie, how excited are we for this? Should we introduce ourselves before we get going? Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi guys, this is Queenie of TCPA World and partner at Troutman Amin.
Also known as Puja J, Amin, to the extent you want a real name. I'm not sure that that's
I'm good
really.
with Queenie.
Okay. Of course, your friend, those are Eric J. Troutman. I don't know why we introduce ourselves. I feel like everybody that shows up for these things knows us, but maybe not. Once again, I'm very sorry. I know a lot of you probably just got notice of this webinar like 3 hours ago when I sent around the only notification via email, but I put it on TCPA World. So hopefully you guys are all following TCPA World. All right, let's level set. Massive, ridiculous development. I mean, ridiculous just like in terms of how big it is, not like it's a bad development. In fact, it's a very interesting development. There's a lot to unpackage here, but the FCC has issued a proposed notice of rulemaking. This is not final. Nothing we're going to talk about today has been done. Okay, so let's just put that in our heads and understand it. We're going to be talking about a lot of potential changes, some really, really big, some like medium, all interesting, but none of these changes have taken place yet. These are all, in our experience with the FCC, these are all things that at this moment you could call likely to happen. That doesn't mean that it will happen, but likely to happen. And all of you, right, who are listening to this, and all of your friends at all of your different institutions, and hopefully you share this video widely with people when it becomes available on our YouTube channel, which now has like 30,000 subscribers. Like, I love all of you. It's so funny. It's just going straight to the roof. But anyway, as you pay attention and learn and talk about and socialize the potential changes, understand that you and your institution and your friends and buddies have an impact here, or potentially can, if you make comments to the FCC once the NPRM and the comment period opens. All right, so you guys have heard me talk about comment periods before. You've heard me talk about how important it is to get to the FCC. That's literally why this process exists, is to have the commission hear from you about what you think about these potential changes, right? So if you have thoughts on this, if it's like, yeah, we should do it, you should tell the commission that. If it's like, no, my God, this is a disaster, you should tell the commission that. And of course, REACH, Responsible Enterprises Against Consumer Harassment, right? The big trade organization for the lead generation industry, will definitely be moving forward with some advocacy here. And I would love to hear from you in terms of what you think REACH's positions ought to be on some of these important items. So that is my commentary to level set. Puja, any thoughts before we start diving into some of the changes, potential changes?
No, let's dive in. I mean, just to clarify, this has not been published, right? We're still waiting for the October 28th hearing to see what the commission's doing. As most folks know, the government is shut down right now. So, we'll see if the October 28th meeting even moves forward, to be honest with you.
I think it'll move forward.
Okay.
And Pooja's right. So the protocol here is first open meeting. At the open meeting, the commissioners will vote to circulate and publish this notice of proposed ruling. Once that is done, then there will be a comment period that will run, usually about 30 days. And we of course on TCPA World will let you know the deadline. Okay, so let's get into this. We're not going to cover every single little nuance. This is, a very thick document. There's a lot of pieces to it. We're going to cover, though, a lot of the nuance here, and we're going to give you some really good things. We did not put together slides because slides are so boring. You just look at like words. You'd rather look at us. So I'm going to use transition Post-it notes. You're going to love this. Okay. So I'm going to start with caller ID issues. And for those of you following along at home, that's going to start at paragraph 30 of the potential NPRM. So the first change, and we're going to start, it just kind of works out this way. These are going to be like the smaller things we're going to talk about, and then it's going to get bigger. But they're big for some people, right? So first, those of you that are with carriers or that have phones, you might notice that if something has an A-level attestation, many times there'll be a check mark now next to the phone number when it comes in. The court or the FCC thinks that's a little bit confusing for consumers. and it might imply that this communication is more trustworthy than it really is. And so what the commission is saying is you do not have to, as a carrier, put a check mark on an A-level attestation call. But if you choose to do so, you must also include caller ID, CNAM, the name of the entity that is calling, must be included on the screen anytime you're going to include a check mark or a attestation. All right, pretty straightforward. They provide some statistics supporting this, very interesting. TransUnion suggested that their calls are about 105% more likely to be answered when they're branded, and about 76% of Americans, according to the data, would rather engage with one of these branded calls. The FCC views that as indicating trustworthiness when you actually see the name of a company or of a caller. And again, it is not requiring all carriers to include this information, but it is requiring carriers to include this information if they're going to use a check mark or other validation on a attested calls. They are not required to carry a logo, so keep that in mind. However, the commission is asking whether or not a logo should be required. So let me just pause and say, those of you who are interested in caller ID, those of you who would want to see, right, branded caller ID be more widely available and not for cost, this seems to be an opening where the FCC is saying, is it important that carriers provide caller ID information? There's questions about whether or not they should be required to carry logos, right? Required to carry logos. Very interesting opportunity, right? And I know there are caller ID reputation solutions out there. There's branded caller ID that's offered by all the carriers. So the language used by the commission here in this section, again, you're talking about like paragraphs 30 through 37, are pretty vague. It's pretty open, a lot of questions that are being asked. So in theory, this could gut all of the caller ID reputation services. In theory, it could be opposite. It could be a huge windfall boom for these services as carriers have to pay for advanced services or supply these maybe at cost or at margin to people that want to access their network. Right? There's a lot of opportunities here, both good and bad, for people who play in the caller ID space. So I would encourage you to really pay very close attention to these provisions and let me know what you think Reach should do on these pieces. One other thing is also very important is the commission is considering whether or not a attestation would require CNAM to be provided, meaning that you could no longer, as a carrier or a voice service provider, sign off on a call as a attested unless you provide caller ID information, right? So that's another thing that they're looking at, right? So one is if you're a carrier and you're going to do a check mark on an AI attested call on a handset, you must potentially do caller ID, questions about what that should look like, branded logos, etc. And then secondly, separately, should you just get rid of AI attestation if you don't do CNAM? Very interesting question there, right? Very interesting. I know a lot of people are going to have a lot of opinions on that, and wait till we get to the next one. But Pooja, before I go further, thoughts?
No, I just think it's a good opportunity for folks who, want to chime in to provide more clarity to the FCC on, how different operating systems work, right? Just giving a little bit more background so it can be useful when the FCC does make a decision. I think there's a lot of confusion on whether folks can even, provide CNAM or whether they can't, or whether it's beneficial, and also the cost, right? I think it's a good opportunity to get the FCC on different cost levels when it comes to this.
Be very interesting to see where the FCC comes down on, per call branded caller ID solutions and the cost. I mean, this is really a vehicle. This NPRM is a vehicle to take a look at everything that's going on around caller ID reputation services right now, and it's fascinating. To me, it's fascinating. So, all right, closely related but separate. So separate that I even made a different post-it. This is a big one. This is really interesting. The FCC is considering requiring originating providers to verify that transmitted caller ID information is accurate. And in a footnote here, footnote 68, in this context, an originating provider, who's the originating provider? Who is this responsibility going to fall on? The originating provider includes the VSP, the voice service provider, that originates a call from a direct end user customer, providers of call branding solutions, and anyone else who obtains the caller identity information that is transmitted from the originating end of a call. So everybody, it sounds like all the intermediate carriers will also have the obligation to verify that the transmitted caller ID information is accurate. Now, this needs to get fleshed out, right? Because I don't understand how an intermediary carrier could verify that the transmittal information from the voice service provider was accurate. I'm assuming what the commission means is that the intermediary carrier has to attest that it is accurately passing on what it received from the originating carrier or the VSP. I'm assuming, but that's not clear. But what is clear is that if you are now going to be passing caller ID information, you as the voice service provider, the VSP and the originating carrier at minimum, you guys are going to be busted if the user, right, is spoofing or not using the right name. Very interesting. And by the way, in terms of what is the right name, the commission's default, of course, is the legal business name of the entity calling or the legal name of the person calling. But one of the things they're also looking for is, are there exceptions, right? Should there be nicknames or brand names that should be permitted, and under what circumstances should those be permitted, right? A whole host of issues. But again, for those of you that are, CPaaS, those of you that are offering communications platforms, voice service providers, and originating carriers, this is a huge new requirement, potentially, that you have to verify that the transmitted caller ID information is accurate under, pains and penalties of, I don't know, maybe getting killed, like so many of these carriers have been killed recently. So to me, this is very interesting. Oh wow, we're over 200 people are here live. That's amazing. I mean, I sent one email on this. You guys are so attentive and so amazing. I really appreciate that. But you should be here because this is really big news. So again, to me, that's massive news. I can think of a lot of our platform clients, Puja, and what this means from a KYC perspective. What this means from like a monitoring perspective. Think about a whole new set of policies you have to build out, right? And that's at the VSP platform, CPaaS level. I'm thinking about the intermediate carriers. I'm thinking about the originating carriers, and of course the terminating carrier, right? I mean, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to kind of think how this is all going to play out. Just amazing to kind of see how this evolves. And to me, there's a ton of issues, but I don't know that Reach is going to take a position on this issue. But Pooja, what do you think? What are your thoughts here?
Well, I just think it's going to be difficult for, companies to implement like the technical requirements here, right? Companies are going to have to start looking at how they're going to have to work with carriers and the branding providers, and just to make sure that everything is correctly transmitted across all devices and networks, right? So I think for those folks this is going to impact, you really want to chime in to talk about that. Again, talk about implementation costs, right? Just talk about how feasible this would even be for your entity.
Okay, I agree. And now we're going to get to something super nerdy. So I'm calling all you super nerds. Out of like the 219 people that are here, I'm going to say we've probably got about 15 super nerds, right? Like I'm a pretty big nerd. I'm a pretty big nerd, but I'm not like a super nerd. But I know we're going to have some super nerds. We need super nerds to help, because I'm not going to lie to you. This is one thing that is over my head is the wrong phrase, but I don't have a complete grasp of it. Rich call data. The FCC, if I'm reading this order right, I think I am, starting at paragraph 49, is looking at essentially rewriting the entirety of the protocol for telecom in this country and moving from our standard, proxy SMS services into something called rich call data, which I don't have a complete understanding of what RCD is. I know what RCS is. I don't know what RCD is. And I would love to have somebody who's like a super nerd maybe come on Deserve to Win and help me break this down. Because if I'm reading this right, the commission wants to just move everyone onto RCD all in one foul swoop. That takes us really from shaken to something called passport. And there's a tremendous number of kind of additional data sets that need to be passed along at the same time. And again, maybe this is not as big of a deal as it seems to me because I don't really understand RCD completely. Like, I'm just gonna be honest with you, right? Like, look, you guys know I know just about everything, but when I don't know something, the nice thing about the Czar, all that credibility and integrity I have, I just straight tell you, I don't know, right? I don't know enough about RCD to really understand what this means from a technical standpoint, but I know it's a shift in protocol in terms of how calls are handled and what data sets are transmitted. That feels like a pretty big deal for a lot of folks, right? I mean, we're still barely like, getting through the VoIP on the shake and stir and getting all through the rural networks and whatnot. And now we're going to something that's a completely different protocol. I'm fascinated by this. This is very fascinating to me. So again, if you're a super nerd, don't be like a medium nerd. I want super nerds that are really deep into this, or if you know somebody that is like a real technological wizard, I'd love to go on the Deserve to Win podcast. I want to run through what RCD really means and how big, or maybe not as big as I think it might be, would this shift to RCD be? Pooja, I don't know if you've got thoughts on that. Maybe you're a super nerd and you know about RCD.
No, not when it comes to RCD, but my plain reading of this section was just that, in addition to providing, the phone number, the identity, you're going to have to provide more information about your company. And I think the FCC is really looking here to see, whether they should, enhance the stir shaken model, right, and make it more conservative. So I do think it's going to have a huge impact. Again, I'm like you, Eric. I don't really understand what the RCD means from a implementation and operational perspective, but it does seem to be requiring more of the stir shaken model.
I mean, there's just a lot of data sets. And my understanding is there's a lot of data sets, additional data sets that get passed, and then this
Making the
passport thing
website.
is like some way to lock in the additional data sets. Again, I don't know, but I know there's at least 3 or 4 people, probably more like 20 on this call that are like, yeah, I know all about this. Troutman, why don't you know about this? All right, well, whatever. Educate me. I'm not afraid to be educated. Come on to Deserve to Win. Tell us all about it. Shoot me an email. Okay, now, dun, 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 now we get to something fun. RCD is so nerdy. This might be
Finally.
my favorite. This might be my favorite part of the entire ruling. And it's not TCPA related. Spoiler, you would think I'd be like super excited for the TCPA stuff, and I am. By the way, we haven't even teased that yet. Massive changes to the TCPA potentially on their way. We're gonna get to that at the end. Like that you want to be here for the end of this. Just trust me. Like massive stuff at the end of this. But to me, this is probably the most interesting thing. How we're going to be dealing with foreign originated calls. Now, you guys have heard about the Keep Call Centers in America Act, where it's going to basically like penalize companies if they move call centers overseas. I don't know, maybe it gets traction, maybe it doesn't get traction. You know what's a way more effective way of keeping call centers in America is flagging for consumers on their handset calls that are coming from overseas. And that is exactly what the FCC is proposing to do. If you look at paragraph 68 of the new ruling, of the new, I can't call it a ruling, the new proposed ruling, they want to require, I'm going to just read this to you. I'm just going to read the sentence. So cool. I think it's cool. I think it's a really good idea. I'm not going to lie to you. I know a lot of you guys are watching this going, Troutman, you're killing me. But hey, man, we've got so much spam coming from overseas and scam coming from overseas. I'm sorry, maybe you shouldn't have a near shore or offshore call center. I'm just going to come out and say it. But listen to this. We propose to require providers to identify calls that originate from outside of the United States to transmit that information over the entire call path and to transmit to consumer handsets an indicator that the call originated from outside of the United States. Isn't that amazing? Can we imagine what that would look like for consumers? All of a sudden now, instead of seeing a local touch phone number, they're going to get like a little, I don't know, asterisk or like a little pineapple or something. I'm not sure what the symbol would be, but some kind of symbol that would say, this is not coming from America. It's coming from the Philippines. It's coming from Mexico. It's coming from Pakistan.
Maybe
It's
a
coming from
flag to
India.
represent where it's coming from, the country
A little
flag.
flag. No, but
Mhm.
see, look, I love you, America, and I might be running for Congress soon, but Americans do not know their flags, right? So they'd be like, what is this? Is this, the Massachusetts flag? They don't know. But in fairness, I'm going to include myself in that. I couldn't identify foreign flags either. But the point is, there needs to be some kind of an indicator, I would say not a flag, but an indicator of some kind that this is going to be from a foreign country. I mean, you want to talk about calls not getting answered, right? I mean, if you get a call from a marketer or from anyone and you're not expecting a call, I mean, I guess if you're like from the Philippines, you're expecting a call from the Philippines, different. But if you're just like a regular dude like me that has no particular connections to the Philippines and I'm getting calls from the Philippines, I am not answering that call. There is a 0% chance that call gets picked up. So, I mean, from a suitability to come to market in America, man, these overseas BPOs, call centers, love you guys. I know there's probably a bunch of you watching. This is bad news for you. But I'm not sure it's bad news for the American consumer. I feel like this is kind of a common sense idea. I haven't talked about it on TCPA World yet. I think I'm going to. Maybe I'll put a short up on our YouTube channel about it. Dear Americans, the FCC proposes to identify foreign robocalls when they're received on your handset. Is that a good idea or a bad idea? I feel like you're going to get about a 98% take rate on that concept. So again, I'm not one to just roll with the majority, but in this particular context, I can't say that's a bad idea. I don't know, Pooja, what are you thinking? What are you thinking here?
I think it's fantastic, right? Even for folks who are facing lawsuits, right? To be able to identify the bad actors or, even argue that we didn't make the calls, right? That some offshore vendor made the calls and we were, it was unbeknownst to us, but I think it'll make it enforcement actions easier, right? In the United States and just, provide more clarity. And as a consumer, I love the idea, right? I probably will never pick up that phone because I have difficulty talking to folks who, don't always speak English or have a heavy accent, etc. So I think it's great on all fronts.
But wait, we're not done. Still looking at the foreign calls, right? So one thing they're looking at is indicating on the handset. Here's another thing they're looking at. Currently, you guys know that carriers are allowed to use, quote, reasonable analytics, right, to block calls. We've at Reach said you can't use reasonable analytics turning on the content of calls, right? That is a no-no. We've asked for the commission to weigh in on that petition. They have not yet done so, but there's news at the end of this that indicates that they might, and we're going to talk about that here at the end of this webinar. So stay to the very gritty end, and you'll hear about that. But what they are saying is those carriers that are using reasonable analytics, they're looking at, quote, requiring voice service providers that use reasonable analytics to block calls to include whether a call originated from outside of the United States as a factor in their analysis. So you wouldn't be required to block all foreign calls, understand? But you would be required to take that into account as part of your secret sauce, right? Because you guys know it's like a black box. None of them have to reveal their formulas, right? So, but part of their formulas, part of their weighting, part of their algorithm would have to be, under this proposed rule, that the call came from overseas. Now, that's a good thing in theory, right? From a weighting curve perspective, if you are an onshore call center, feels like you are more likely now to get your calls through. But once again, if you are an offshore call center, BPO, nearshore, sitting in the Philippines somewhere in the Caribbean, I mean, you're about to get crushed because not only are consumers going to be notifying, the call blockers out there are now being instructed to take into account the fact that this call came from a foreign location in determining whether or not to block the call. Wild. But I can't say I disagree. I don't know. I don't know. Someone's gonna throw something at me. I can like feel somebody like throwing stuff around their office right now saying, Troutman, how can you agree with this? This is just censorship. And just because the call came from somewhere else doesn't mean that it's inherently unreliable. And this is jingoistic. And how dare you? And part of me agrees with that, but then part of me is also like, yeah, but there's so much scumbaggery that happens overseas. We'd be fools to just be blind to that, right? And why shouldn't the carriers take the location of the call into account since that is content neutral? That's not a constitutional violation, right? To me, that's a data point that might maybe should be considered. I don't know, Pooja, am I going too soft on the FCC with this so far?
No, on this one, I agree with you too, right? I think it'll definitely help spot spam traffic, right? And additionally, the FCC is suggesting that folks coordinate with other countries, right? When you're using, US companies are using legitimate offshore companies to route customer service like calls and et cetera, right? So if you have those policies and procedures in place as they're suggesting, and you're able to coordinate with the legitimate good actors overseas, essentially the goal here is to reduce the spam scam traffic. So I think this would be a good way to do it.
And we've got one more item on foreign calls to talk about, which I think is also, I mean, it's something everyone needs to pay attention to, right? If you're dealing with foreign calls, if you're buying leads from BPOs that are offshore, if you're, a carrier that is handling, foreign point of entry calls, paragraph 79, identifying the source of unlawful foreign originated calls. I'm just going to read this to you. We seek comment on how to better identify the source of unlawful calls that originate from outside of the United States. In this context, the source of an unlawful call includes the country from which the call originated, the originating voice service provider, and the maker of the call. So they want to come down and actually find, right, that voice service provider, that platform, that point of entry, in addition to the country, which I think is interesting, and of course, the maker of the call. Now, how do you identify the maker of the call in Pakistan? And I guess the concept would be you identify that maker and then somehow you try to shut down service, right, through a point of entry into the United States. I don't know how you would do that. I'm not sure the commission knows how to do that. But to me, the interesting one is the originating voice service provider, right? And maybe the VSP is a VIP network out of Belgrade or something, but there's going to be some point of entry right into the American network. And I think what the commission is getting at is we want to find those people. Now, we know that the ITG is already doing a lot of this, but I think that there is a microscope now on the foreign originated calls. And I got to tell you again, I think that that is probably a good thing. And there's a number of questions here. If you look at paragraph 80 and 81, I'm not going to read these to you, but the commission's got a ton of questions around this. So again, those of you who are super nerds, really into the technology, the Dave Frankels of the world, you want to get in there and have some fun because there's a real opportunity. Again, I don't know how Reach is going to land on this because we've got some companies that use nearshore, right? I mean, this is fascinating. It's a fascinating development. I'm going to have to take the temperature of the board and of the membership to see kind of where Reach is going to land. Ultimately, of course, Reach's mission is designed to prevent unwanted robocalls. We have to align ourselves with any practical, intelligent step that's going to prevent unwanted robocalls. It is a question in my mind whether the wholesale targeting of calls just because they originated offshore aligns with the mission, but directionally it seems to. So this is something we're going to have to talk through. I'm laughing because I know a couple of people are just going to lose their minds with me saying that, but we do have to consider these things. All right, I'm going to leave that topic, Puja. Anything else on the foreign originated calls getting nuked potentially by the FCC?
No, I just think the biggest takeaway here is I think the FCC is trying to help the regulators identify unlawful traffic, right? So this is kind of an avenue to make their lives easier to come down on the unlawful traffic and the providers of such.
All right. So now buckle up, everybody, because we're about to get into the potential TCPA changes. And some of these are pretty wild. Some of them make complete sense. Some of them are pretty wild. And let me just start. I'm just going to start with my thoughts on this, which is, you remember there was like that delete thing, right? And past administrations have been like, we'll delete 2 regulations for every 1 regulation that we passed, and then like somebody was like, we'll delete 3, and someone was like 4. And like Trump came in and was like, you must delete 10 regulations for every 1 new regulation that you make. Which, I mean, like the spirit of that makes sense. Like we're all for deregulation and self-regulation, which is what Reach is all about. But when you really stop and think about it, like if I've got to make a regulation, I have to delete 10, right? That's like that's a lot. And so I think from a certain perspective, the commission was looking at the CFR, was kind of looking at the TCPA and was thinking, man, what do we delete? And of course, we gave them like 20 things to delete. And ironically, what they deleted was actually, I don't think, on the list of the 20 things that we proposed. And at least one of these, I thought there's no chance that they were going to delete this. But we're going to get to this. This is interesting. So I'm going to start with like the least crazy of the potentially crazy changes to TCPA. And I'm going to unpackage this and I'm going to tell you, I don't agree with, I'm going to tell you, I don't agree with this, but I'm going to give it to you straight first. Okay. The call abandonment rules. So the FCC proposes, there are two of them, to eliminate prohibiting calls from disconnecting an unanswered telemarketing call prior to at least 15 seconds or 4 rings, and from abandoning more than 3% of all telemarketing calls. So the ring requirement is, I don't know. I mean, if you want to get rid of that one, I guess I could see why, right? This is like the old, the comic strip or sitcom where you're in the shower and the phone starts ringing and you're like, crap, and you try to get to the phone, and by the time you get there, what happened? They hung up, right? So to prevent the, abandoned call of the person streaking across their living room to try to get to the phone, which really was a thing in the 80s and 90s, much less a thing today, there was a law that said marketers had to let that phone ring at least 4 times to give you a reasonable chance, or at least 15 seconds, a reasonable chance to get to your phone, as opposed to just ringing and you just never know, who called. Which again, when you had a landline, that was a phenomenon, that was a real thing. Now we all have cell phones. We don't, I mean, you see a missed call like all the time, right? So that's like that one. Okay, like I can get on board with deleting that one. It does seem like maybe it doesn't have much impact anymore. But abandoning the 3% of all telemarketing call, abandoning the abandonment rule on 3% of dropped calls or abandoned calls, I don't like that, right? So what that means is if you, let's say you make 100 calls, right? You as a caller can't have to make sure that out of those 100 calls, um, if 100 people, actually, I be more clear, out of 100 answers, right? 100 answers, so it's probably like 10,000 calls to get 100 answers. 100 answers, they answer the phone, hello, there should be someone on the phone talking to you within 2 seconds, right? Within 2 seconds, there should be a person there. Hello, 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 hello. Great, right? Only 3 times out of 100 should somebody get on the phone, hello, hello, 2 seconds go by, and no one joined the line. Okay, that's the call abandonment rule. That's a pretty good rule. Where does that rule develop from? It develops, of course, from predictive dialers and auto dialers and multiple line assignments, where an outbound dialer might, let's do, say, 5 line assignment, meaning the agent's available now. They're gonna make 5 outbound calls, and hope, right, that one of those 5 answers. And if 2 answer, well, one's getting dropped. If 3 answer, 2 are getting dropped because that agent's only going to connect to the first one that connects, right? So in order to prevent people from doing crazy stuff like using 10 line assignments, they have put this 3% drop rate on your campaigns, and you've got entire call center manager teams there calibrating, right, their line assignments and calibrating their skill assessments to make sure that that 3% is maintained. The FCC is thinking about throwing that out completely. And this is what I'm telling you when I say, like, I love the FCC, but I'm not sure they're really thinking this one through. They're really kind of just trying to like delete something because I have to. So here's what they say in terms of their justification. We believe that the calling practices these rules target might no longer be a significant source of consumer frustration. That might be because calling practices involving the use of predictive dialers have evolved to become more efficient, rendering our rules no longer necessary to protect consumers. Well, now that is wishful thinking, now isn't it? The truth is, if I believe, I could be wrong, most, not no, most of the wrong word. I believe there will be many good players who are members of Reach who will continue to abide the 3% rule, even if the law does not require it, because they want to treat consumers right. But I know that there are call centers out there that as soon as that 3% rule goes away, now we've got 100 agents and they're running 10 line assignment campaigns, and we don't care how many calls we're dropping. I want my agents talking to somebody all the time, right? And that is the only thing the call center is going to be thinking about is no wait time for my agents. My agents are live all the time. I don't care if it's a 20-line assignment. I don't care if it's a 100-line assignment, right? Because you take away the abandonment rule and there's really literally no limit. I mean, I guess there's like a telephony limit, right? But these days with the data centers able to do what they can do, there's really no limit to how many lines can be assigned to a single agent in a campaign. So I gotta tell you, reach is definitely, look, I can be talked out of anything, right? I'm a very reasonable guy, but I look at this and I'm like, reach, I think, has to come out opposed to this abandonment rule change. At least the four ring 15-second one, I can live with that. But the dropping the 3% abandonment rule, what do you think, Pooja? Am I being too aggressive here? That's just, to me, that's just trouble, man. That's just trouble.
I think it's going to cause more consumer confusion and frustration, right? Especially when agents are just rushing to get to the phone and then being transferred to like AI, for instance, and you're just sitting there waiting for a live agent to connect with you. Consumers are just going to get more and more frustrated, right? And agents are going to be more incentivized to not like to quickly go through their calls, right? And any calls that are not meaningful or unproductive to the agent, they're not necessarily going to care about just hanging up, right? Because they want to get to the next better lead or whatnot. So I think, for consumer and for businesses, getting rid of the 3% abandonment rate is not a good thing. And I think the businesses that do comply with it have better consumer engagement and better conversion.
Well, and that's the thing though, is it's not the brands you have to worry about, right? Like Wells Fargo is not going to crank up its dialer to 20 to 1, right?
What's going to be their
It's
offshore call
it's the
center?
it's the lead gen guys. I love you, lead gen guys, right? This is why Reach has to like play a real role here, right? It's the lead gen guys, right? They're in the middle, they're invisible to consumers. Consumers don't know who the hell is calling them, right? You've got Bob who bought data from John and then sold it over to Stan to make 10,000 calls for him, then sell it back to Bob who auctions it off to the brand, right? Like the consumer doesn't see any of these people. They only see the brand. So the consumer, right, who actually receives the call and goes through to the Wells Fargo, let's say, they also didn't have a bad experience, right? They were the lucky one that got called, got answered, they stayed on the line, they got a good treatment, and they got transferred. So Wells Fargo might be thinking, well, there's nothing wrong with this process. The people that are coming through are perfectly happy. Meanwhile, right, these guys, you're probably offshore, but maybe who cares? Maybe they're domestic. They're just blasting people to get them on the phone to transfer back to Bob to transfer to Wells, right? I don't know, man. To me, that is dangerous, dangerous, dangerous. But I'm gonna think it through. Look, this is new, right? We all gotta think it through and digest. But I don't know, man. That one strikes me as pretty crazy.
To me, it just
Uh,
it leads to more robocalls.
I don't see. I mean, depending on how you define robocalls, right? I mean, but more automated calls, more multiple line assignment, more drop calls, more people getting phone calls with dead air. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? You're talking about, a scourge of instead of people calling you, being on the line, trying to sell you something you don't want, now you got a scourge of hello, 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 right? You're not likely to answer the phone anyway. Now you're never going to answer the phone. All right, let's move on to. This is the biggest one. To me, this is the biggest one. We've got two left. They're both huge. This is the hugest one. And again, I'm not sure where I come down on this one. I don't know. I'm starting to sound like a turncoat to the call center industry because this is designed to be a huge gift to them. But I'm just so concerned with consumers and stopping unwanted calls and getting, answer rates up so that the good guys can actually make some money. I'm not sure I like this, but ready? The FCC is considering getting rid of the internal DNC rules. Ah. Yeah, that's crazy. What do I mean by that? Literally what I just said. If a consumer calls in and says, "Stop calling me," you don't have to write that down. Okay, so let's just
But
walk
you
through.
still have to abide by the revocation rules. So
Exactly. And so that's the trick, right? So this is definitely a trap for the unwary. And it really is like a Venn diagram. Kind of makes you kind of think like what the actual impact is. But first, let me read this to you, right? So this is a very long order. It's got lots of analysis, lots of questions everywhere else. For some reason, on the company specific DNC, it's like one paragraph. It's like the biggest potential change, right? Just modifies just the core principle under the TCPA that you have to have a telemarketing DNC rule in order to make outbound marketing or solicitation calls, right? And you have to honor when a consumer tells you to stop. You have to keep that company specific list for 5 years, right? Like core. And they're just like, we're gonna scrap it. It's been around since 2002. We're gonna scrap it, or 2003. And here's what it says. And again, I'm not hating on this because this might actually end up making sense. It's just incredible how little time is spent actually in the NPRM on this issue. We also propose to delete the rules requiring callers to record a subscriber's do not call request and place the subscriber's name, if provided, and telephone number on the company's D&C list to avoid calling that number. Massive. Massive. And it basically just says we seek comment on this proposal. The justification is that the FTC would still have the requirement, and therefore under the TSR rules, marketers would still have the requirement, just not under the TCPA. So it's a redundant set of rules. Why have two regulators looking at it? Interesting. Obviously, one thing to think about is the private right of action. So the teeth, right, for the internal D&C enforcement would be definitely watered down. But let's actually talk it through practically, because what Puja said is right? You take away the internal D&C rules, that doesn't mean that you can hammer a consumer all the time. So remember, we've got two different restrictions under the TCPA. We've got the regulated call provisions, and we've got the D&C provisions. Now, the caller ID rules, sorry, the internal D&C rules fall under the D&C provisions of 227C, not the regulated technology provisions of 227B. So even if this rule comes to pass, if you are using regulated technology, that includes AI outbound voice, right, which you guys all love to do, AI outbound voice, ATDS, SMS messages, any pre-recorded calling, any ringless voicemail, pre-recorded voicemails. Once that consumer says, stop calling me, you can't use that technology anymore, right? So even if the internal D&C rules go away, there's still a whole lot of meat left on the TCPA bone when a consumer tells you to stop, right? You've still got that revocation potential class action sitting out there. So you do still want to stop using regulated technology. However, if you are calling manually or pseudo-manually, right, using a safe select or something, that stop is no longer the nuclear remove them from your list and never contact them again that it once was, right? Now, if they're not on the D&C list, you can just keep calling them. Isn't that incredible? Hello, stop calling me. Hello, stop calling me. And they just keep calling you back. And there'd be nothing you could do about it in that situation. That is fascinating to me. Now, if you're on the D&C list, that's where it becomes kind of a question in my mind, is the consumers on the D&C, they have to have prior express invitation or permission, or that prior express invitation or permission is revoked. Is that the same rule as the revocation rule under 227B? The answer is probably yes, but actually not terribly well defined in the case law. And since the commission has just said the internal do not call list, right, is nuked, does that mean that you can no longer revoke consent from a D&C perspective? That doesn't necessarily follow. I get it, but it is interesting to me, right, that you'd consider a scenario where some calls are going to be allowed that weren't allowed before. Maybe that means just the numbers that aren't on the D&C, but maybe it includes even numbers on the D&C. So that, I think, needs to get fleshed out. And I think that's a place where there ought to be comment and further discussion. But Puja, I'm going to stop and let you take it away. Get rid of the internal D&C rules. What do you think?
Well, I think obviously the main purpose of the internal D&C is to allow a consumer to have a company or entity specific opt-out, right? And getting rid of the internal D&C rules is essentially going to trap the consumer into still receiving additional calls that they may not want to from that specific entity. So I think, it has so much value to it. And more importantly, on like the litigation front, right? The internal D&C requirements almost force companies to have a proper revocation procedure, policies, and training. And when you get rid of that, right, companies, think they don't have to comply as much with like revocation rules, right? They're not as apprised about it because the internal D&C lawsuits go away, which should be a good thing. But again, then the uptick in the revocation cases are going to go up, and you're not going to have requirements, right, obligations to comply with these rules. And I think the nice thing about the internal D&C rules is that companies are forced, right, and they're aware, and agents are aware of the policies and procedures around it. So I think it provides a lot of good education for businesses to be able to comply with the TCPA.
That is a really interesting point. the plaintiff's bar might actually be rooting for the internal DNC rules to go away, even though they lose a specific cause of action. They will gain an entire industry that is now turning a blind eye to valid revocations.
And then I'll add,
Interesting.
with that, the revocation on the defense side, right, it can often be more difficult to defend, right? Whereas like the internal DNC procedures, you have the policy, you can get your main deponent on, get their testimony that you follow the rules and this was a one-off situation. Whereas the revocation rules, right, which we'll get to here in a bit, right, it's gray, right, whether that revocation was reasonable or not. And, that often takes, more litigation, deeper litigation to assess whether the judge or the jury is going to think it was reasonable or not. So I think it's going to become harder to defend those revocation cases.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It is very, very interesting. There's a lot of
Also,
permutations.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, and then with the FTC rules, right? The FTC doesn't govern all the entities, right? So I think there's more gray area on, well, if the FTC's rules don't apply to me, right, then, because there's certain exempt entities under the FTC, but then the FCC rules still apply, right? So then it gets confusing as to which rules apply to which entities and causes more confusion for businesses on how to comply with the two regulatory bodies as well.
It's just very interesting. Like this one, I kind of previewed where I think Reach is going to land on the rest of them. I'm not sure where we land on this. I could definitely see, the pro-business self-regulatory side of Reach that sets standards saying, scrap it. We don't need any more predatory abusive lawsuits, so get rid of the provision. And then I could also see hey, we want to keep society and the lead gen industry, complying with consumer requests, so we want to leave it in place.
You know what I would do?
This is
So
between them.
I would try to get rid of the national DNC rules, right? And have an opt-in mechanism, right? And so that way, you're only getting calls that you opted into, and then you're doing your specific opt-out requests to specific entities. I understand that would open
Stop
up
it. That's
a lot more
unconstitutional.
calls.
Unconstitutional.
I
Unconstitutional.
understand that, but if it was available, I think that would be the appropriate. I think the national DNC has less weight, right, and has less meaning than the internal DNC requirements.
Okay, so let's get now to the last one, which I am categorically and 100% in support of. And this is the best news that any of us are going to get today, which is the horrible revocation rule, which was set to go into effect April 11th, 2026, that said if you say stop to a text message, you have to, stop all communications across all channels for that purpose or for any purpose that requires the same or greater level of consent. You don't even have to unpackage that. It was complex, it was gross, it was anti-consumer, it was horrible, and it is on the chopping block. Now, again, it's not gone yet, but here's the sentence. It's a beautiful sentence. Paragraph 103. We propose to delete the requirement that a caller must treat an opt-out request made in response to one type of call to be an opt-out request for all types of calls, which harms consumers, or to modify it to give consumers greater control over their right to stop unwanted calls. So this looks like it might be going away. Also important, the businesses might be given the ability to determine whether or not there's an exclusive means for consumers to revoke consent, right? We've been looking for this since 2015. 10 years we've been waiting for the ability for a business, not unreasonable, not like you have to go to Antarctica and hand in a notarized, bill or something. Just, call this number so we have a dedicated team, or send an email that we have a dedicated team, or use this word stop, right? Just like the instruction says, right? And we will honor it. Whereas currently, as you guys know, right, any phrase that is freelance English, any phrase that's just in English that says stop calling me, leave me alone. Well, stop would be the wrong one. Leave me alone. I don't want to hear from you. These phrases, which we would recognize, right, cease and desist, as a stop. Many times the text message programs can't pick those up, but it is 100% right now free for all because TCPA class actions are being filed because these companies, including like big companies like Pizza Hut, right, just got sued allegedly for failing to honor a free form stop message. There's a ton of these cases coming in. this ruling potentially opens up the door to allow businesses to dictate, hey, it says reply stop to stop, right? So if you want the message to stop, reply stop, right? Pretty straightforward, really. So to me, obviously, I am 100% on board with this. I think this is consistent with what consumers expect. If they're receiving a marketing text message, they want the marketing text message to stop. They don't want to receive, they don't want other messages from, let's say, Wells Fargo. I'm picking on Wells Fargo. They don't want their low balance alert or their ATM receipt notifications to stop. They want their marketing text to stop, right? Or if they say stop to an MFA, right? They don't want us to have stops for every other kind of message conceivable. They say stop to a student loan text. They don't want your mortgage text to stop, right? This is just common sense. But for some reason, the former administration threw common sense completely out the window with their proposed revocation rule. And this administration, God bless them, is here to fix that. And I love it. So finally, after all that stuff we just went through, and you heard me, I was lukewarm on a lot of this. I am 100% on board with scrapping and getting rid of that ridiculous rule that was going to go into effect in April 11th. I only hope that the commission comes out with their final rule fast enough that there's no chicanery in terms of whether or not that April 11th rule becomes effective. You can expect Reach to come out forcefully in favor of revocation of that rule and to encourage the commission to rule quickly, right? I know they probably want to rule in an omnibus fashion on all of these issues, but maybe come out with a Spartan quick ruling, just kill shot just on this issue to give companies, particularly big enterprise companies, the comfort that they can continue to contact consumers in a reasonable way after April 11, 2016 or 2026, excuse me. Puja, thoughts?
Well, obviously, this one is a rule that would cause more litigation, and serial plaintiffs would have taken advantage of this rule, right? So this one is, I think, think of it as a second opportunity to talk to the FCC, right? They specifically seek input on less restrictive alternatives, right? What methods should be required, how to ensure that your revocation means are clear, right? And so for a lot of folks that are already complying and have a good process in place with internal DNC requests, this is a time to speak up, right? Explain to the FCC what works for you and what doesn't work for you, right? And if you can show them that it's been working for X amount of years, for decades, then I think the FCC is going to be more willing to get rid of this rule. And also highlighting the fact that, this is going to open up a flood of litigation, right? It already has. It's going to come April 2026, and it's going to cause a lot of frivolous lawsuits. So in order to prevent that, I think the FCC really needs to shut this one down. And also, it provides consumers, an opportunity to clarify what calls they actually want, right? I may not want to receive any marketing calls, but I definitely want to know if I'm late on a payment or if a fraud alert, right? And most consumers are the same. So allowing consumers to retain that right or that request or that preference, if you will, I think is really, really important. So I agree with you. Obviously, this rule should be taken away, killed before April 2026. And I love that the FCC put this in here and gave us another opportunity for us to speak up.
Wonderful. You guys heard what Pooja just said. If you want that revocation rule to be gone, look, I'm not going to lie. The commission's obviously leaning that way, and knock on wood, they're going to stay that way. But who knows, man? Some of these other groups are very powerful. So you want to come forward, have your voice heard. Last thing I'm going to talk about, and then we'll get to the questions because there's a few really good questions I want to answer. The commission also said it's going to be dismissing a bunch of old petitions. I'll just kind of put them up here. Old petitions that it does not intend to rule on anymore. And there's a bunch of them. I mentioned the Reach petition. The Reach petition is not on there, meaning the Reach petition is not going to be dismissed. They are going to be ruling on the Reach petition at some point. For those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, Reach has asked the commission to clarify that thou shalt not, as a carrier, block calls or label calls that are legal under the TCPA, one, or block calls or label calls based upon the content of their message. Both of those would be an unconstitutional application of state censorship, essentially, because the commission's rules are being used by Spectrum licensees, the carriers, to censor speech based on unconstitutional precepts. So that is something that we have asked the commission. We still do expect the commission will be ruling on that. Not immediately, of course. We've got some other fish to fry now, maybe not bigger fish, but other fish. And I like to fry fish. So this is very exciting. Now, let's look at a couple of questions. I'm going to start with you, Joey Liner. Very good question, very important question. Joey asks, in essence, the rule regarding notification of foreign originated calls, is that only for robocalls, scam calls, spam calls, or does that include hand raisers, include people who fill out a form, people who've given you consent? Do you have to identify the foreign origin of calls even in the context of consent? And Puja, the answer is yes. That is the proposal. Now, Joey, you might be thinking, well, maybe Reach should come out and say, well, if it's a consented call, right, you shouldn't have to display that. Understand that's a whole nother level, though, of validation and verification, right? Because now the voice service provider, the originating carriers, would have to validate that it was consented. Now, arguably, there's already that requirement, right? Arguably, in order to determine whether or not to pass a different data set, maybe like a SIP or something, to the terminating carrier to determine whether or not to display the logo when it's, or not the logo, but the symbol, whatever it's going to be, if it's foreign originated. So I think there's a huge technical hurdle there, but just as written, what the commission is currently considering is all foreign originated calls, period, full stop, even if they're consented, even if they're hand dialed, even if they come from a rotary telephone on a copper wire, right? You would have to identify those if they did not come from the United States of America. That's the proposal. Again, it's comment time, right? If you've got thoughts on that, if friends of yours have thoughts on that, encourage them to make a comment. We've got one now from Michael Ahern on point number 3. I'm not sure what that was. When revocation is limited to specific mechanics, example, text stop to stop, you don't have to put in every message the instruction. If they made this a requirement, it fixes everything. I think what you're saying is the commission should, in addition to allowing the business to dictate a single point of stop, should require the businesses that want to make use of that revocation to put that instruction in every message. And I don't disagree with that, right? If you, as a business, want to limit the consumer to having to say stop as your only way of opting out, then, as a counterpoint, the business should probably say, in order to opt out, reply stop in every message. I know that that is not great experience, especially for those of you using like machine learning or AI prompting. It's not a very attractive consumer experience, but you could see that tug and pull. And then the last question here, does the deletion of the proposed revocation rule impact the same requirement for text senders who capture multiple categories of text consent? E.g., does an opt-out of one category impact all categories? That is exactly the essence of what we were talking about. Puja, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, so if the FCC gets rid of the proposed revocation rules, text senders would no longer would be required to treat a consumer's opt-out as a global opt-out, right? So your consent would be tied to one set of communication, and then your opt-out would be tied to that specific type of opt-in request as well. So meaning, if you opt out for marketing text messages, right, that wouldn't necessarily opt you out of fraud alerts or informational services, et cetera.
Yeah, but I think it goes beyond category here because now we're looking at multiple categories of text consent, or I guess maybe it is category specific. But the way I would look at it is, and look, this is going to be defined yet. This is still a proposed rule. It's not even final yet, and it's definitely not fleshed out. But if I'm reading directionally what the FCC is saying is, if you've got multiple consents, right? You got a consent for alert for low balance alert, and you got consent for to send a student loan message, right? And these are totally different products, totally different things. And the consumer says stop to one, that one dies, but the other one is still there. You still have that consent, right? And if you've got a consent that is a broad enterprise consent, right? I think, again, needs to be teased out, but now we're going to Pooja's point, it's going to be categorical, right? You send a, collection message. Probably if they say stop to the collection message, if that was on student loan versus an overdraft, you probably on a category basis would have to stop both, but maybe not, right? Maybe only one business line would be impacted because that was a text message regarding student loan and not on overdraft, so you only have to stop the one. That's going to be fleshed out, right? It needs to be fleshed out. I think ABA in particular, or MBA, need to come forward and talk about that. And I think everyone is going to need a great and fine lawyer when all of this comes into play. People tell me all the time they wish they could buy stock in Troutman Amin. Yes, you do. And I got to tell you, right now, it's a good time to be the Czar. It's a good time to be the Queenie. We love all of our supporters. We love all of you for being here, and we will talk to you all very soon. Bye.